Okay. We are broadcasting now. Welcome to Powerhouse Arena's virtual events. My name is Chris, the events coordinator, and tonight we're hosting What a Character, writing about real people in fiction and nonfiction, which is a virtual book launch for Like Love by Michele Morano. We'll be in conversation with James Cañón. You can buy copies of the book at powerhousebookstores.com. The link is in the event page, and I'll post it here too. If you have any questions, you should use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and they'll take your questions at the end of the event. And I'll introduce James and Michele now. James Cañón was born and raised in Colombia. He received an MFA from the Columbia University. His debut novel, Tales from the Town of Widows and Chronicles from the Land of Men, has been translated into 11 languages and published in over 20 countries, and was made into a film. It was also selected as one of the 10 best books of the year by the American School Library Journal. Michele Morano is the author of the memoir and essays Like Love and the travel memoir Grammar Lessons, Translating a Life in Spain. Her essays and short fiction have appeared in many journals and anthologies, including Best American Essays, Fourth Genre, Ninth Letter, and Waveform, 21st Century Essays by Women. She lives in Chicago, where she chairs the English department at DePaul University. All right, I'll hand it over.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you to the Powerhouse Arena for giving us the time and space to discuss literature. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight, Michele and I will be talking about character in fiction and nonfiction. And she will be reading an excerpt from her book, her latest book, Like Love. And I will read an excerpt from my second novel, which is still in the works. First of all, congratulations, Michele, on your new book, Like Love. It is, for those of you who don't know, it is a memoir in essays. To me, at least, it reads like a collection of secret stories, like unheard until now. There's some like little mystery and suspense in most of these essays. And that, coupled with your honest prose, makes the book quite compelling. It is a great read. I highly recommend it.
Thank you.
So welcome, Michele. Yes, you want to say hello. And I'm going to start grilling you with questions, because that's what we're here for.
Sounds good.
So first, and I'm very interested about this, in nonfiction, the I is also a character. And most people, including myself until recently, we mostly immediately assume that the I is the self, is the author. But that's not always the case, I understand. In your book, it gets even more interesting because you have first, second, and third person narrations. So my question is, how do you decide which point of view to use?
Thank you for that really great question, James. And also, I just want to say a quick thank you so much to James and to Chris and to Powerhouse Arena. It is, it just sucks that we're in this pandemic and that we can't be together doing these kinds of events. But it is so wonderful that people can join from all over the country and actually all over the world. I understand that your mom is watching from Colombia. So I just wanted to take, what's that?
And my brothers.
And your brother and your whole family. So I just wanted to take a really quick moment to say in my very bad Spanish, hola a la madre de James en Ibagué, Colombia. Estoy muy contenta que usted está mirando y que puedo hablar con su hijo tan maravilloso. So welcome everyone in Colombia. And also James and I have wine. So just to remind anyone watching, if you want to turn this into cocktail hour, you can join us. But thank you for the really great question. So yeah, when not long after my first book came out, I got kind of a wild email that began, it was from Dennis in Cleveland. And it began, hey, Michele. And then it said some very generous things about the book. And then it ended with, next time you're in Cleveland, let me know. Dennis. And I was like, Dennis in Cleveland, who do I know in Cleveland named Dennis? And who is this person? And it took a little while before I realized that I didn't know him at all. He was a perfect stranger. But because he had read my essay collection that is mostly first person personal narratives, he felt like he knew me. And so he had this sense of intimacy because the personal essay is a very familiar form. The wonderful writer Philip Lopate talks about this in the introduction to his Art of the Personal Essay, that the personal essay is a friendly form. It assumes a friendly audience, not an antagonistic one. And it kind of leans in and tells people things that makes them feel very intimate with the author. I've had that experience too as a reader, you know, reading someone's essay collection and thinking like, we're friends now, and then meeting them and going like, you're not who I thought you were. And so I think that it's easy to forget sometimes how crafted the narrator is in a first person collection. It isn't that it isn't me, it's just that it's not all of me, right? And so when one of the bits of work that happens with any essay I write is that I have to get into character. I have to figure out, who is this narrator? Is she the sassy version of me, or the serious version, or what's the, I mean, because often it's more than one in a single piece, but what is the range of selves that are going to appear in this particular essay? And that's part of the work of figuring out how to, you know, both what is the story exactly, but how to tell the story and how to make it, you know, the idea is always to go through the self in order to get bigger than the self in some way.
So it has nothing to do with the need to be more intimate or to create distance in order to be more objective.
Well, no, I think sometimes it does. You know, writing in the second and third person certainly creates a kind of distance, although sometimes you can create distance writing in the first person as well. It depends on the material, and sometimes when the material is particularly emotional or dramatic, I will reach toward a point of view that's not first person. It's dangerous to do that, I think. You know, we've talked a little bit about how everyone always wants to write in the second person. It's like, feels really daring and fun. And when it works, it really works. When it doesn't work, it really doesn't work. And the third person is even riskier, because I think it can often feel gimmicky or precious or overly writerly. When we know that the she is actually the I, or the you is actually the I. So I just did one of each in this book, and the last essay is in third person, and it's, you know, I was on the fence about it for a long time, but ultimately I felt like it allowed me to it opened up some spaces for me to do more in terms of kind of making a collage type essay that some experiences of my own are the subject in some sections, and in other sections, the subject is art or literature, and it kind of comes together in that way. But yeah, it was definitely risky. It was definitely risky.
Okay, would you let us hear some of that now?
Yeah, I thought I would read from one of the first, since we're talking about character, I thought I'd read from the essay that probably has the most characters per page of the whole book. It's a really short essay called Restless. And there are a lot of kind of secondary characters. And from the bit I'm reading, you won't even really be able to tell who's the main character other than the I. But I just thought I would share this. In the mid-1980s, when we were still stunned, still thinking it was a big city thing, a faraway thing, not a Metro North Hudson Line thing, David wasted away. We knew as soon as he couldn't kick coals, as soon as his smoker's cough intensified, because it would have taken fortune greater than anything we believed in to protect someone with that lust for life, that lust for any man walking down the street in tight blue jeans and cowboy boots. Before all that, there was the time when David catcalled a guy from his car on my mother's block at 11 o'clock at night, and the guy charged toward him, screaming threats, forcing David to run around for a while before parking and running, forcing David to drive around for a while before parking and running like hell to the second floor apartment. By then, we thought he might not show up. We'd started cooking, my mother and her ex-girlfriend, Sue, who lived in the spare bedroom, and Michael, a sophomore in high school, and me, the 19-year-old who didn't live there, but sometimes slept on the couch. That Friday evening, my mother, Sue, David, and a passel of their friends had gone to happy hour after work, and my brother and I had watched movies until we each fell asleep, him on the couch and me in the recliner. When my mother and Sue burst in laughing a little before 11 p.m., I got up intending to go home. But Sue was hungry and David was on his way, so my mother pulled out a package of pork chops and Sue started slicing onions, and their laughter lured us into the kitchen. I peeled potatoes while Michael cracked a dozen eggs into a bowl. By the time David burst in, indignant and shaking, a breakfast dinner was sizzling. "He called me a cocksucker," David yelled, and there was a 3-second pause before he added, "and he doesn't even know me." And the rest of us doubled over laughing so hard we cried, and David cried too, because how could he not? How could he not? David was a nut, my mother always said, in the affectionate way she described anyone who made her laugh. He was handsome and flirtatious, a man who would sling an arm around my shoulders and comment on the way a blouse hugged my breasts without wanting anything in return. That night he was drunk, the way everyone was always mildly drunk, and driving home because home wasn't too far away and the speed limit on city streets just 30 miles per hour. But he was also afraid, the first time I'd seen him wide-eyed and shaking. David didn't relax until we started eating, and then he settled into telling stories in his usual animated way. There was the time his mother chased him down the street toward the bus stop, demanding he change that ridiculous shirt. The time he took a nap at his office desk, snoring so loud the boss heard him down the hall. We laughed and licked our fingers, the pork chops juicy, potatoes fried crisp, eggs scrambled with peppers and onions and plenty of salt. All of it so delicious, we ate second helpings and thirds until it was gone and David and Sue and my mother were sober again. They yawned and stretched, stubbed out cigarettes, talked about what the rest of the weekend might hold. Sue said, "You're going back to the bar tonight, aren't you?" And David said, "Are you crazy?" And Sue said, "Bullshit." And we all laughed. It was 1 o'clock in the morning by then, and I felt full and awake, restless. Not restless like David, who kept shifting in his chair and opening his mouth as if to speak, but restless in the way of early adulthood, when you want something you can't name, something that takes you out into the world and casts your life into flattering relief. "I'll go with you," I said, wanting to get up and move and feel the night air on my skin. "Come on, let's go dancing." David raised his eyebrows at my mother as if to say, "Should I take her to the gay bar in the rough area of town?" My mother shrugged, knowing that David wanted to go out just long enough to go back in again, someone else in tow, and I wasn't that person. But I couldn't bear the idea that a Friday night injected with all this energy could revert to its dull self. So I turned to Michael, 16 years old and as awake as I was. "How about you and I go to a bar?" His eyes widened as he sat up straight and tried to play it cool. "I mean, I guess, if you really want to." "They won't card us at this hour, right?" I asked. David said, "Nah." Sue said they might, and my mother shrugged again. "If it doesn't work out, just come back home." I drove us to a small bar near the community college I attended, the kind of bar people stopped at on their way to or from somewhere else. Michael tried to look calm as we entered, shifting his glance left and right, while my own glance went immediately to the pool table, where 2 high school friends, John and Scott, were playing. I hadn't seen them in almost 2 years, not since I dated them both in a way, along with my friend Monica, who'd gotten her driver's license before anyone else. Her parents used to let us borrow their car as long as we promised not to allow others into it. And we did promise, of course, on those Friday nights before we picked up Scott and John and headed to the liquor store, and then the drive-in movie theater, and then a spot along the Hudson River where we wouldn't be seen. There we did shots and danced by the water's edge and riffed off each other, laughing until we couldn't breathe. John and Scott both had girlfriends, popular girlfriends, and we all worried about them finding out because, as Scott once said, the only thing worse than being cheated on for sex is being cheated on for fun. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michelle. That's very beautiful. And I guess for me, it's even more beautiful just because I've read the entire book, but also because I've heard some of those stories directly from you.
Mm-hmm.
I know your sensibility and I know mine.
Yeah.
So yeah, it really touched me.
Yeah.
Now, how do you develop nonfiction characters? I mean, how much freedom do you have? Because to me, it's all about perception. You know, what you remember about someone may not be what or how someone else remembers that person. And you're dealing here with mother and brother and
Right.
friends who
Right.
are the friends who are alive and your brother is alive.
Right. Right. And also with someone who's dead, right? Who I want, and I think that it's interesting because I think often we think it's easier to deal with people, real people who are no longer with us because they can't object, right? But there's such a, I feel at least, such a duty to try to portray people not just accurately, but to kind of get at something about them that is like the center of how I remember them, right? I mean, like David, for example, I was thinking about this just before coming onto this call. He was somebody I didn't know very well. I mean, he was a friend of my mother and her girlfriend, then ex-girlfriend. And so he was kind of in the periphery, in the background, but he's somebody who I just really, really liked. And I really missed. He died very quickly, it seemed to me. I think because I didn't know what was going on with him until it was very late. And I never saw him once he got sick. So it was like he just disappeared and I've just always missed him. And it's interesting, I think, the way that we sometimes feel almost a stronger allegiance to those people who play lesser of a role in our lives, maybe because we don't have a lot of complicated emotions or our relationship with them isn't complicated in the same way it is with those who are close to us. One of the powerful things I think about nonfiction is it does kind of keep us honest in a way because we know that real people are going to read what we've written about them. And I think that at some point in the process, whether a character is alive or has passed on, there comes a moment as a writer where you have to go, okay, imagine I'm that other person and I'm reading this. How am I going to feel about this? Is this going to feel to me like an accurate portrayal? You know, I feel very sure that David would have said yes. And I feel very sure in this essay that my mother would have said yes as well. But you're right, it's always an ethical dilemma. And I always tell my students that you're not going to be able to remember everything. You're not going to be able to remember every detail. But there are details that matter and there are details that don't matter quite so much. So maybe you don't remember exactly what your cousin was wearing on that day, but you know how your cousin dressed generally at that time of life. It doesn't really matter if you choose details that will help the reader into a scene, if those details are in the grand scheme of things kind of meaningless. But if you choose to say that your cousin, you know, hit you in the head with a baseball bat, that detail matters. So that better really have happened, right? So I always say if the detail matters, then it matters.
So is that where you draw the lines between memoir and fiction?
I think yeah, I think that's fair to say, that I do feel like if you're calling it nonfiction, the events had to have happened. And we understand that memory is faulty and that imagination plays a role in memory, and that we have to be careful about trusting ourselves. But I also think sometimes that the story of memory is the really interesting one to tell, because the story of what we carry around in ourselves as experiences, I think is worth mining for meaning. But yeah, I think that's a difference for me between between writing nonfiction and fiction. So what about for you? How do you, so you know, in nonfiction, I'm not making up any characters. I'm deciding who gets to make a cameo, who gets to hang around, who I have to leave out. On occasion, I may need to take 2 characters or 3 characters and kind of make them into a single composite character. That's frowned upon by some people, not frowned upon by others. I think every writer has to make their peace with that. But I'm curious in fiction, you know, how do you come to your characters? How do you develop them?
Well, I'm sure every writer has a different method or technique, you know, like every technique is like a fingerprint. For me, when I think about a character, I think of it as a verb. I'll go into that. You know, young writers tend to think of character as an adjective. So what I mean is that they're often seduced by characteristics, adjectives like she's pretty or she's evil or she's selfish, or backstory. You know, she was raised by her grandmother in a farm or she was abused by her father. They put a lot of work into thinking up all these elements that often lead to stereotypes that don't move the story forward. For me, a character begins with a want, and that's where the verb comes into place. What does this character want more than anything? And what are the unique ways this character pursues this desire that are different from the way any other character would do so? And in turn, this wants affect every aspect of a character. If you truly know what they want and how they would go about to get it, then you will discover the way they speak, the actions they take, choices they make, the way they dress. And I think it's true in real life as well. You know, people do weird things to get what they want. Some of them make it to the news. And it is that unique way they do these things that distinguish these people from anyone else in the world. And that makes you either love them or hate them or fear them or whatever. So that's kind of my approach.
Do you think that people are driven both by what they want and then sometimes by the attempt to disguise what they want or to hide what they want?
Yeah, but see, I'm still seeing it as a verb.
Yeah, right, of course. Yeah. No, I love that idea.
Yeah, that's and yeah, if they try to disguise something, that's what they want. They want to disguise that.
Right.
It's something they want, you know, like really, really want. And I insist that when I'm teaching, like know what your character wants. It's really, really important, more than anything.
And where in the process of coming up with a story or a set of stories do you start to develop the character? Does that come first?
Yeah. For me to create a story that I can believe in, I must start with that character.
Okay.
At the beginning of the process, there's only one thing that's important to me, and that's getting to know my character, getting to know that profound journey my character is undertaking, and the changes in the character's life that go along with that journey. Everything else comes later. You know, all the thematic ideas are not something I impose on a story. There's something that I discover as I get to know my character. And the same goes for structure. You know, people are so concerned with the structure, defining structure from the beginning. You know, for me, structure is something that reveals itself to me as my character's journey unfolds. Those are just tools of craft that I use to translate the story to the readers.
I love that idea of translation. Yeah.
One thing, I grew up hearing, and this is in my family, of course, but also around, that you should never air your family's dirty laundry in public. And in many families, this is actually considered like a breach of loyalty. And I know the people who start speaking to you and the families, and there are some of these major problems. In your book, your parents and your brother are characters in several of your essays. How do you deal with this in your own family?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's a tricky question because I grew up definitely in the kind of family in which secrecy was a big deal and you were not supposed to tell your family stories. My This essay collection has at its center a kind of storyline that keeps coming back and coming back, which is that in the mid 1970s, my mother left my father for a woman at a time when that was not talked about. It led to a very ugly custody battle because women who loved women were considered unfit parents and men who loved men as well. And this was something weirdly that we never talked about in my family. My mother had this long-term relationship with a woman before Sue, and then she had a relationship with Sue, and she never talked about the fact that these were lesbian relationships. It was understood that it should be secretive, that we shouldn't talk about it to anyone else. So it was just a bizarre kind of imposed silence that was very, very damaging, I think, to everybody. I mean, not least of all my mother. And so one of the things, so I think somewhere along in there, I came to the realization that secrecy is very dangerous and that my parents, I just felt like didn't have a right to, their right to privacy did not trump my right to tell my story of my life. Right? I don't think I have any business telling their stories during the times of their lives that I wasn't in it. But for the stuff I was there for, I feel like I have absolutely as much right to tell that story as they do to want me not to. But they had the very bad fortune of having a daughter who's a writer. Now with my brother, it's very different. He comes in here and there in the collection of essays, but he didn't choose to have me. I was just, that's, you know, I was in his life, he was in mine. There's a lot of stuff I would like to write about my relationship with my brother, but I have not wanted to, or I haven't found a way yet to do that that feels comfortable for me. So I just think that it is true that it's difficult to write, and I think that, but I think that family loyalty is a very, very dangerous concept, and that it's incredibly damaging to a lot of people. So I don't put a lot of stock in that, actually.
What about the legal consequences of using real people in nonfiction? Because you are using, yes, your family, and you can deal with that. But what about friends or friends who are no longer friends? You know, like in fiction, we don't really have that problem as long as we have a disclaimer. But in nonfiction, besides a good lawyer, what else?
Well, but people do occasionally get sued for using fictional characters, right? I mean, using real people who are identifiable. I mean, that's the thing. As far as I understand the libel laws, in this country, at least, it's a little different in like Great Britain, I think has much more stringent libel laws. But in this country, you have to be saying something that is untrue. You have to know it's untrue. So it has to have malicious intent. And then I think often it also has to be the kind of untruth that results in loss of livelihood for another person. So it's pretty tough to do that. I think that the legal issues are often really secondary to just ethical issues of treating people, because, you know, if you're the type of person who can write your own story, that's a certain kind of power, and not everybody has that power. My parents were not literary people. They could never have written their own stories. And so I had to understand that, like, I have a certain kind of power here and I have to use it very judiciously and carefully. So I think it's really important. And with friends and, you know, lover type people, I was just careful to change the names and some identifying characteristics on certain people with whom I'm not in touch anymore. You appear in one of my essays, James, and I gave you the essay and said, what do you think? Do you want me to change anything? That's fine. But other people, I made them unrecognizable to, they will recognize themselves, but other people won't recognize them necessarily, because I just want to protect people. I don't want someone's role in my story to become something bigger than it really should be, you know? But I want to go back to this idea of, you know, the ethics of writing good characters in fiction. And I wonder if you could read to us a little bit from your novel that's in progress, but that is also, is it true you're reading from an excerpt from something that you turned into a short story that's going to be published this month?
Yes, it wasn't a short story, but I read part of it at this reading for Unpublishable, which was a reading series organized by Chris at the Powerhouse Arena. And it was stuff that we could not publish for whatever reasons. My reason had to do with ethics. It's because I was writing about a person that I had met, and I felt like I needed to get her permission for various reasons. I don't know if I should get into details, but yeah, well, I was traveling by bus in Colombia to this town where my novel takes place because I wanted to do a little research, and I fell asleep. And when I got up, there was this transsexual sitting next to me, and we hit it off. You know, we started talking about many things. And once we got to this town, Dolores, which is the town where I was doing the research and where the novel takes place, we kept talking. We went to the market and all that. But, you know, like during the journey there, I was so worried about her because, you know, we are still not just in Colombia, we're in the countryside of Colombia. This is like a small village down south. And, you know, even though Colombia has like same-sex marriage, and Colombia has been legal since 2016, people are still very hostile towards LGBTQ people. So I was really concerned, and that's part of it. You know, like I felt like I owed this person that. I never thought that she would become a character in my book. It was until later when I was here in New York that she was like a second character, and then, you know, you start writing, and she has a major role now. And then I started like try to track her down to get that permission. And it's a very sad story because finally a friend of mine found her, and she pretty much became a prostitute now. It's a very sad story. But she remembered that encounter, and, you know, it made it very beautiful. So yeah, I'd like to read a little bit from that. It's 7:33. I just want to remind people that, you know, if you have questions, you can just type them in the Q&A button at the bottom, and then at the end, we'll try to answer them. So I'm just going to read from the beginning. This is the scene where she's on the bus, and I'm removed from the scene, but it's just the beginning. The minibus had just reached the outskirts of Dolores, and though its windows were covered with a thick layer of dust and soot, they could not conceal the depressing landscape of crumbling roofs and rusty steel. "Only a miracle can save this town, señorita," the small man said in a raspy smoker's voice to the young woman sitting next to him. They were sitting in the first row, the man on the aisle, the señorita by the window. "It pains me to see Dolores ruined like this, but it pains me even more to see that nobody cares. Nobody." The señorita was looking out the window, not caring. For the past hour, since the small man had gotten on the bus and sat next to her, she had been playing games in her mind, counting the houses and cottages she saw along the road. 8 so far. Imagining what the houses looked like inside and who lived in each of them. Giving a name to every member of each family and assigning them occupations. Making this one fall in love with that one and that one cheat on this one with the other. Her journey was almost bearable that way. The man's monologue was tedious and her seat was uncomfortable. Of course, being 6 feet tall did not help. Long limbs automatically made most trips inconvenient. She wore enormous sunglasses, a pink light mini dress, and white high heel shoes. The shoes she had removed immediately after sitting down to ease the discomfort they caused her. This used to be a prosperous town, the man went on, but then they started coming, the displaced people. They multiplied like cockroaches, and in less than 3 years brought about the downfall of Dolores. He stopped and looked at the señorita, hoping that this summary of the demise of his village had intrigued her enough to comment on it or to ask him a question. She turned her head toward her right armpit and took a whiff. Her excessive perspiration was ruining her dress. The men ignored her apathy and continued talking. Some of them claimed that it was the communist guerrillas that forced them to flee their homes. Others blamed that the paramilitary groups. But all of them say that they were landowners back home. His tone was ironic as he spoke of the last line, casting doubt on the claim by the displaced. He turned again and looked at the girl. Are you listening? Uh-huh, she replied without looking. The guerrillas forced the men to flee their homes. The guerrillas and the paramilitaries, he corrected her. He knew better than to take sides in this matter. No one was to be trusted these days. How old are you, if I may ask? She said she was 17. And do you go to school? She nodded. Good. Education is important. Look at the displaced. They cannot even find work because they can't sign their names. So what do? They turn into beggars, thieves, prostitutes, the kind of jobs all of us humans have the potential to do without much training. He suddenly noticed the way the señorita was dressed and regretted having included prostitution in the list of unchallenging occupations. He now pulled the business card from his shirt pocket and handed it to her. In case you're looking for a good place to stay in town, he said. The señorita took the card and turned it over and over in her hands, her face unable to hide her discomfort. Then she peered at the card and nodded. The old man noticed she was holding the card upside down. It says that my name is Laureano Mendieta and that I am the owner of Hotel Mendieta. He gently took the card from her hands, turned it right side up, and gave it back to her.
Oh, that's marvelous. Thank you.
And actually her name was, her given name was Suberbia. And that was fascinating to me when she said it. Because, like who would choose that as a name? Suberbia is like one of the 7 capital sins, like the haughtiness, like the really bad form of pride.
Mm.
That's how she feels about herself. This is what she wants the people to know her. So yeah, it was fascinating.
And that was her name in real life, you said?
No, that's the name she gave herself.
Oh, she gave herself. She gave herself. Right. Oh, how funny.
The real name is actually Juan Carlos.
Yeah, of course. Wow. So can you tell us just a little bit about the development of this character? Because I'm so interested in the idea that it was kind of a secondary or a minor character, and somehow through the writing process, Suberbia became more front and center and developed more.
Well, see, it's a little bit of what I was saying earlier, how I go with the character once, that's how I develop a character. She was just a secondary character that appeared in someone else's chapter. But then I realized what her want was, and it was so powerful that I was like, no, she's got to have a major role. And I started exploring more her side of the story. And then all of a sudden, yes, she becomes one of, it's a long story, but she becomes one of the main characters in the book.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Another thing that I wanted to know, it's you are obsessed with time and memory. I know this because you have said it many times in interviews, but also because I know you. And there are 2 concepts that are closely interlinked. How reliable are those memories when creating nonfiction characters? I mean, what role time and memory play when you're creating them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So depending on the material, sometimes I begin just with memory, and I think I just want to capture what's been, rattling around in my mind for however many years, sometimes less time. And I want to try to get You know how it is that sometimes memories come back to you as you go through your day, and sometimes they make you cringe a little, and you think, why am I remembering that? Like, why is that? That was such a minor thing, and why am I still feeling some little sense of shame or something from that? Or some little sense of elation or humor, like, why, of all the funny things that have happened in my life, why does that one thing keep coming back to me? So sometimes I try to just write the memory, and then I start looking at it and going, could that be, is that actually what happened? You know, there's one essay in the book, and I should also say that what holds this essay collection together is the idea of unconsummated romance. So all of these stories about crushes and infatuations and odd little entanglements that we have throughout our lives, even and especially when there isn't going to be a future to them, a romantic future. And so one of the pieces in the book is about travel. And it's about spending the most romantic weekend of my life in Hamburg, Germany, with a man I met as soon as I arrived. And we did all of this tremendously romantic stuff all weekend, but there was never really a romantic connection between us. So it was this, we just kept finding ourselves in these positions that made me think, like, should we be connecting here in some way? But we weren't. And in that essay, I had this very specific memory of walking from the train station to the place where I met him. And so, and it was at a youth hostel, outside of a youth hostel. And thanks to the miracle of Google Maps, I was able to like look up the youth hostel, trace the steps, and it was nowhere near correct. And I just sat for, it took me like a day and a half. I kept going back to the map and saying, how can this be? I so remember. And if I can't trust that memory, then what does that mean? And then it turns out there are 2 youth hostels in Hamburg, Germany. And when I discovered the second one, I traced the steps. I was like, there's the corner, there's the apartment building with a guy where the guy called down to me from the balcony, and I found it all exactly right. It doesn't always work out that way, that your memory is true, but sometimes memory holds something that's truer than fact. Right? It kind of holds an emotion. And so I try not to fact check memory to death. I don't want to say anything that's really wrong. So I definitely do research and stuff, but I also, I want to allow that memory and the past even become something that we're making of it as we're living, right? And we incorporate it into ourselves. And so I think if you're not writing the kind of book that really needs to have absolute facts because it's a history or because it's involving, you know, allegations or something like that, then I think you can be a little bit squishier with the things that you remember but may not always be able to track down fully. Yeah. But time, I'm just fascinated by time. It's the thing that that sort of rules our lives, and yet it doesn't really exist in some ways. And so it's a really, I love literature that really plays around with time, like Proust's, I'm only remembering right now the first translation, Remembrance of Things in Search of Lost Time. That's the better translation of the title, because it's all about how do we reclaim the past? How do we relate to the past? Or someone like William Faulkner, who's always weaving, not always, but in some of his books, weaving together those crazy long sentences that have past, present, and future all together at one time. And I love that. I love the way when you go to certain places, you feel like you're in the presence of the past and you can feel time kind of fold up like an accordion. I don't know if that gets anywhere near your question, but
it does. Have you ever read this book talking about time? It's called Einstein's Dreams.
No.
Very short book, and it's this guy who imagines Einstein dreaming, and every dream is like 2 pages, and every dream is a different concept of time.
Oh, lovely.
Like in this world, time goes like faster if you are like high up, that if you're things like that, like concepts. Most about concept is fascinating for fiction.
That sounds great.
It's
Okay.
fun. Yeah.
You're going to have to text me the title so I remember to read that. Yeah, thank you. That's really good. James, I had another question for you, and then, okay. I think we have one question, so let's have a reminder to everyone that if you have any questions for either of us, please put them in the Q&A. Can you talk a little bit about how much of yourself is in each of your characters? Like, is there an extent to which, you know, the way that they say portraits are always self-portraits, is that also true with your fictional characters?
My main characters often have a little of me.
Mm.
And that bit almost always has to do with my own psyche, my way of thinking and certain behaviors, but they also have qualities and flaws that are relevant to the plot line. I think it's almost inevitable to put a bit of yourself, even unconsciously. Like, this happened to me, like with the first novel, when I started doing readings of the novel, people would come to me. I remember this friend of mine, she came up to me and she was like, I have only read a few stories in your book, but that bitch, that Rosalba, that bitch, that's you. And she was right. I mean, there was so much of me in this character, and it was a woman, it was a female character, but the way she did things, the way she thought, her logic and her behavior, and
Yeah.
and it was totally unconscious. Like,
Yeah.
I never thought I'm gonna make her like me. No,
Yeah.
it just happens. So yeah, it definitely happens. It's part
Yeah.
of the writing. It's unavoidable.
And you have the most marvelous characters. Let me just say again, if people listening have not read Tales from the Town of Widows, I highly recommend this. I'm having trouble with the mirroring there. There we go. Whoops. Okay. Because it has, first of all, it has so many characters and they're all so fascinating, and it's very funny and it's very profound. It's just, I love this book so much. And I'm really excited for the new one too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Talking about fiction, you also write fiction.
I do, a little bit, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Does genre affect your character creation or inspiration process? I mean, is it the same as when you write fiction?
No, not at all. Completely, totally different.
How do you approach it?
I mean, in fiction, I'm kind of like you. I mean, trying to figure out what does the character want, but then also just putting the character, you know, just constantly in different situations to figure out how do they act, react, respond, and then start to get to know the character. Like I'll often start with a character who is similar to someone I know. So to a friend or a coworker or a relative or something, and then I start to see how dissimilar they are, you know, so it's a process of them moving away from somebody familiar to me and taking on kind of a personality of their own. Whereas in nonfiction, it's funny because the primary characters are people I really think a lot about. And the secondary characters, I mean, this is going to sound so awful to say, but I think often I'm bringing them in service of telling a story. And that person was there. And so, you know, they're doing something that's important for understanding the story, but it's not a history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's definitely different, and also at the same time very much like the way I do it.
Right. Now, I mean, people who write like narrative biography and who are dealing with real people, sometimes people who have been dead a long time and they're resurrecting them into characters, that's a very different situation. And I suspect I'd be curious to know what that process is like compared to fiction writing. Because they are kind of bound by the truth, but also they have to fully imagine the inside of a person in order to bring them to life on the page.
Now, when we write fiction, I usually tell my students to not be concerned with audience, not so much. I don't know if that would be the same for nonfiction. You know, like, I want to know who you're telling this personal stories for. Like, and what I mean by that is, most writers I know write with a private audience in their mind. Sometimes it's just one person, like, or just a small group of people. You're writing this for this person because it is a story that concerns that person, or not. You just want this person to hear this story, to read it.
Mm-hmm.
Since you write a lot about family, I sometimes wonder if you write for your dad or your mom, regardless of whether or not they can or would have wanted to read your book.
No. No, I think actually, if anything, I write for my teachers. I think, there's kind of an amorphous audience early on where I'm just like, it's kind of like, I think about I don't think specifically about grad school, but it's that same feeling of when, you're going into a workshop and you want to impress people, you want to get something out there. It's like that kind of an audience that's very receptive and ready to help. But I actually encourage students to try not to think too much about audience too early on in nonfiction, because there's so much stuff that you have to write that you don't want anybody to read and you don't want to feel, and you have to say, because if you don't say it, you're never going to get past it. It's just going to keep coming up again. But, and then through the drafting process, you start carving away some of that stuff. And later in the process, you really start thinking about what are these particular people going to think when they read this, or how might they feel? So I think it's a process of refining, but I think any kind of a really specific audience too early on is really hampers nonfiction writing. It's hard to be honest and worried about people's reactions at the same time. Yeah. What audience, I'll ask you this and then we have to quickly go to the one question that there is, but what audience do you write for?
I usually just have like one or two readers in mind. So I write for specific readers that I really trust. That's like my only audience, really.
Yeah.
I really try hard not to think of readers in general.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
We only have one question.
Okay.
We still have time for maybe one more question ourselves. How about teaching? How do you go about teaching?
I
mean, characters.
Yeah. Well, I think that I think it really goes back to specific details, as specific as possible, in terms of people's behavior, in terms of the way they speak, in terms of how they dress and what their mannerisms are and gestures. I think sometimes it's easier for people for writers to describe people in fiction because they're thinking of them as characters, whereas in nonfiction, they're thinking of them as people, and they often forget how important it is to give the reader everything we would in a work of fiction in order to feel like we're in the presence of that person, right? And so I think I really focus a lot on details and also on perspective, and allowing the narrative eye to have perspective at the moment of writing that the person I did not necessarily have at the moment of experiencing something, right? So there's some space that opens up in the narrator. And in that perspective, it's possible to look at other people from the point of view of the younger self, even if that self is only a month ago, who interacted with that person, and the self at the time of writing, who's developing perspective while creating the character on the page. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah, I think it's important to incorporate that perspective into the descriptions and the exposition on the page.
I mostly, I teach mostly workshops, but when I have to deal with character, I mostly teach by asking questions from my students and like following up on their answers. Like, the one thing I want them to understand is that the fundamental engine of character for me is change. So I ask them questions like, like, where do you want your character to end after this journey she's taking? Is your character's change from A to B or from A to Z, or not change at all? You know, what's the best or the worst thing that could happen to your character, and how would she react? And especially, what kind of obstacles are you setting up for that character so they are forced to make a choice and change? Because character is never going to change unless they make big choices.
Right.
No.
Right.
And I want my students to make sure that whether that character changes from A to B or from A to Z, or not change at all, that the potential for that A to Z must be there. You want to show that journey that the character could have taken.
Mm-hmm.
That's very important. And I think that's what makes fictional stories human. That's what makes us fall in love with characters, because that is what allows us to see ourselves in characters.
Mm-hmm.
We all want to change. We all have dreams we're not chasing. We all have a past that we're afraid to overcome. You know, we have choices that we haven't made because we're afraid. That's us. You know, that's very relatable.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really well said.
So you have one question. I think this question is definitely for you.
Okay. Yeah. If you were a compulsive liar, will it make you unfit to write a memoir, nonfiction? Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, there is a memoir by Lauren Slater that's called Lying, a Metaphorical Memoir, in which she confesses to being a liar. And she tells us up front, it's a story about having had epilepsy as a teenager. And then at a certain point, she lets us know that she didn't have epilepsy, actually. And people kind of freaked out about that book, because they were like, how could she reveal this 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through? And it's like, it was on the cover. Like, it was right there. So I think, generally speaking, you want to be considered reliable when writing a memoir or essays. But I also think that there are times when it is possible to play around with, what does truth mean? And what does perspective mean? And what is the reader's willingness to go along with a narrator? This also raises the question of whether it's possible to create unreliable narrators in nonfiction. And I think it is, but a lot of people say no, absolutely not. If it's unreliable, then it's not nonfiction.
It's almost like a different category.
Yeah, exactly. But I also think, the definition of an unreliable narrator is that the reader and the author understand something that the narrator doesn't understand, right? That's the fictional kind of classic definition. And I think in nonfiction, it's complicated only because the narrator is the character, but there again is that space, that gap that can open up between the author and the performance of the I on the page. So I think it is possible. I'm still playing around with how to make that work, but I don't think being a compulsive liar is a disqualifying attribute, but it makes things difficult.
I think we are running out of time.
Yeah.
But I really want to thank everyone who's here tonight. Thank you for making time, to giving us this hour for us to just talk about character and about ourselves, really.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Chris, again in the Powerhouse Arena.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. This is really great. Very illuminating. I like the separation between writing about parents versus siblings. It's very important stuff. Thank you to James, Michelle, everyone who joined the webinar, asked questions, said hello. If you missed any of it, we'll have it on YouTube. And please buy the book. If you haven't already, we have the link on the event page. And we also have the new book, Unpublishable, with James's excerpt too. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, thank you.
Right. Can I just put in a final plug to buy books from Powerhouse Arena and from your independent bookstores, which are just the lifeline for all of us in the literary community right now?
Great.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.
Bye. Thanks.